we're going to take a look here at how we graph the sine and cosine function. So we're talking about a couple different things here. The first thing is down here towards the bottom of this first sheet. And we're talking about amplitude and period. So amplitude is how high this graph is going to go away from what we call its midline. Its midline for the sine and cosine graph is going to be the x-axis. So when we first start graphing these and we're graphing the parent function, what we're graphing as far as an amplitude is how far off the x-axis does it go. And we find that fairly easily by taking the amplitude as the number in front of the sine value, and we take the absolute value of it. And so then the same thing happens here if I have the number in front of the cosine value, and I take the absolute value of it. Okay, so if there's a 2 there, absolute value of 2 is 2. If there's a negative 3 there, absolute value of negative 3 is 3. Okay, and so then this goes up and down, follows the nice little pattern that we've been kind of working on, looking at the sine graph, and it follows the amplitude going how far up and how far down. Well, we know that the sine function has a period of 2 pi. That means that when it goes from the beginning to the end, before it starts repeating again, it goes a distance of 2 pi. Well, I can change that period. I can make it so that it happens in a shorter amount of time. I can make it so that it happens in a longer amount of time. Okay, and so the way that we do that is we take that 2 pi, the normal one, and divide it by b, the number that's in front of the x. Okay, and we do that with the sine, and we can do that with the cosine. They both work that way. All right, so then that gives us some steps for graphing this. The first one is to find and label the amplitude. Second one is find and label the period with 3 points in between. And the reason we're going to pick 3 points in between is that if you think about your unit circle, we're going to have a starting point and an ending point. So this is going to be our start and our end. And then we're going to go around the circle and look at some important places. The first place would be pi over 2. Second place would be pi. And the third place is going to be 3 pi over 2. So those are the places we're going to look. So we have a start, 3 places in between, and then an end. So really there's 5 points that we're going to be looking at trying to be graphing here. And so when we look at this unit circle, we look at this being a ordered pair that's cosine sine. So when I'm making the cosine graph, I'm starting at 1 and ending at 1. And then I'm going up here to 0. And then I'm going to go down to -1. And then I'm going to go back to 0. Can't really see that. Back to 0. And then I'm going to end up back here at 1. So that's what my cosine graph is going to look like. And then if I'm looking at my sine graph is going to start here. So sine is going to be in green here. Starts at 0, goes to +1. That's a +1, even though it looks like there's a negative in front. +1. Goes back down to 0. Goes all the way down to -1. And then comes back to 0 again. Okay? So we can draw a nice sketch of that, and those important points are going to be needed in our graphs. So let's take a look at that. The amplitude in the sine function here, there's a lazy 1 in front, and so the amplitude is the absolute value of 1, which is 1. The period is 2 pi divided by the number in front, which is a 1, and so that's 2 pi divided by 1, or I didn't need the second divided by 1 there, or 2 pi. Okay, so we've got an amplitude of 1 and a period of 2 pi. So when I go to graph this, what ends up happening is that I start at 0 and I go to 2 pi. This is 2 pi. And I go up to 1, down to 0, down to -1, back up to 0. And it follows the exact same places that we just said on the unit circle. And I can continue going around the unit circle, so I can keep going to the right or on this graph and around the circle. So I can go back up to pi over 2, which now I'm not just at pi over 2, I'm at 5 pi over 2, a nice coterminal angle to that. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, and so now I've got that right side. And I could also go the other way on this unit circle So I could go to the left here, and I could go to negative pi over 2, which is the same thing as 3 pi over 2. Negative pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2, same thing, coterminal angles. Where we could end up at the same place of negative 1. So then that's a general sine graph. These are the places that I'm looking for what happens to these graphs as I continue to change the things that I'm going to be doing to it. So then I've got the cosine graph down here. The amplitude is the same. It's got a 1 in front. The period is the same. It's 2 pi divided by 1, or 2 pi. And so when I graph this, remember that my cosine starts up at 1 and ends over here at 2 pi, back up at 1. So it goes to 1, then to 0 at pi over 2, down to negative 1, back to 0, and then up to 1 again. Okay? So it's important that you notice the difference between where the graph starts, where they go next, where the x-intercepts are, okay, and how far this distance is that they're creating. And of course, I could keep going around the circle with the cosine graph, and I could go backwards around the circle with the cosine graph, and that's fine too. Okay, so I end up with this nice smooth curve. I want to look at the sine graph in the blue and the cosine graph in the black. Make sure that you understand how those things happen and where they come from. Because in this chapter, or this section of the chapter, we're going to be graphing these, and you need to have a great understanding of how these graphs work before we start moving them around.